The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Monday, November 6th, 2023. My name is Sam Seder. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Robert P. Jones, president and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute, author of The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. Also on the program today, Israeli troops surround Gaza City. Trump testifying in New York, judge threatens to throw him out. Key state polling shows Biden trailing Trump in multiple states. Tony Blinken meets with the Palestinian Authority and Iraqi leaders, as well as those in Turkey, as Israel rejects a U.S. push for a pause, despite the fact that Hamas has reportedly offered return of hostages for such a 5-day pause. Meanwhile, huge protests from D.C. and across the world call for a ceasefire. Tomorrow, important elections in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, Mississippi, Virginia, New Jersey. Will give us a better sense of just how badly Joe Biden may be doing with voters. Meanwhile, a poll shows 2 in 3 Americans say household expenses are outpacing their wages, and 76% say the country is headed in the wrong direction. SAG-AFTRA strike continues. Announced over the weekend that producers sent supposedly their last and best offer. And from what I understand, it is garbage. Supreme Court to hear arguments over bump stock attachments, the constitutionality of said ban. All this and more on today's Majority Report. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks so much for joining us at the beginning of the week. As Emma Vigeland says,
it is Fun Day Monday.
So much fun.
Yes.
Obviously, like many people, weekend full of horrible images coming out of Gaza. We're also seeing now the release of more and more footage, it seems like, from the October 7th massacre. I guess presumably as a way to counteract the enormous pressure that, or I should say protest, that has been building across the globe in hopes of halting Israel's bombing of Gaza, at least as a first-order issue. We're well over 10,000 now civilian casualties. Matt Binder managed to find an interview in Hebrew that apparently was translated, where a IDF, I guess, commander suggested that there were another 10,000 Hamas fighters killed, or presumably Hamas fighters killed. Unclear exactly, but nevertheless.
I mean, the 10,000 we already understood was very likely an undercount because they're counting the numbers of bodies that they can find, the amount of rubble that we're seeing and the amount of people stuck under rubble. That's going to be just a slower roll of figuring out how many are dead.
Israeli forces have now surrounded Gaza City. Unclear, how they're going to go about, I guess, entering into what is left of Gaza City. But here is images of massive protests. We don't have a count, but the idea was that there was going to be a march, I guess, from Freedom Square to the White House. And there was so many people that showed up, they couldn't march because it was literally backed up. And I don't know what that distance is, but just an enormous showing for, calling on Israel to at the least stop killing civilians. Let's show these images.
You can see there, if we just keep that, that may be it, that long white line there. I'm not sure if that's the exact, long piece of paper, but it looks like it. There was one in DC with 8,000 children's names on it, printed out one by one in fairly small font, and it stretched for quite a while. The children's, or actually, sorry, not the children. The 8,000 has to be, the civilians so far that have been released. The names of the dead. That's what was printed there.
Wide number of constituencies who were there in support of, against the, or in support of a ceasefire, but also in support of Palestinian sovereignty and human rights. On and on.
There's big ones in Berlin too, which is notable because Berlin I saw somebody get arrested for waving a Palestinian flag early on in the protests, and now they have giant ones going down the street like that.
Here is an interview with Marion Ingram, author, demonstrating in support of Palestinian rights. She is 87 years old. A survivor of the Holocaust, and she's discussing why she's been sitting out in front of the White House on a daily basis, calling for the Biden administration to use some leverage.
Marion Ingram. I'm the author of The Hands of War, which talks about the Holocaust, which is a memoir about my experience as a Holocaust survivor, a survivor of the worst bombing in the Second World War in Europe, and the worst firestorm ever, all done by the Brits and the Americans, was called the Operation Gomorrah. I'm a civil rights activist, I'm a pacifist, activist for peace, and I'm here to ask our government and others to stop Israel from killing people in Gaza, from allowing Gazans to be free at the way, give them the same rights, elemental rights that Israelis experience. This is my wish. This is why I'm here. My husband and I have been here this week every day. We were here last week protesting with Jewish Voices for Peace. Big demonstrations. We'll be here tomorrow. And I'm 87 years old. In 2 weeks I'll be 88, and I'm still doing this for decades now, and I don't think that never again is only until it is again. We keep doing the same thing over and over and over. And what really upsets me is that of all the people in the world, Jews should be the ones setting an example for peace.
And there are a lot of Jewish people setting that example.
In fact, all of the 3 big demonstrations.
This is, these protests came in the wake of Netanyahu basically saying, we reject any humanitarian pause, in his country's assault on Gaza, saying they would relent only after Hamas frees all of its hostages. In other words, not some type of trade. It's also been reported that Blinken's basically said, if you pause, it'll give you more time, ultimately, to continue this assault. It has also been reported in the Washington Post that Hamas indicated that it would release all civilian hostages in exchange for a 5-day pause. That, according to diplomats familiar with discussions that are being held occasionally in Qatar, where some Hamas leaders are based. So that's the situation. The Biden administration supposedly is getting frustrated with Israel refusing to have a humanitarian pause, which is wonderful for them, but also sort of like shocking. Aren't you aware that you are pushing through $14 billion of aid? That may give you a little bit more leverage.
Well, I mean, on the other hand, it helps Biden with the age question, because I didn't realize he was born yesterday.
There you are. It really is more of a question of like, who do they think is born yesterday? I mean, the idea that like, you've got to use leverage in this instance. We'll get into this later, but I saw just a clip of a biography that was being done. When I first heard the name Netanyahu, it was as a 9-year-old or 10-year-old, and it was Yonatan Netanyahu, or Yoni Netanyahu, who was the leader of the raid on Entebbe when the PLO had hijacked a plane and flown to Uganda. And this was the type of sort of like, real life thriller. And the one person killed, or at least was the leader. I think there were a couple of hostages that were killed, but was the leader of this raid, this Israeli raid, who was Netanyahu's brother. And apparently a biographer was writing about Netanyahu's brother, but interviewed Bibi. And back
Just
then,
sent that,
even,
Bradley.
in 1980, there's a clip from, is this the...
I believe this is what you're talking about. We might have seen the same thing. This is an excerpt from the biography.
Yes.
In the 70s.
So I'll read it from it. It's the historian Max Hastings interviewed Benjamin Netanyahu extensively after the Netanyahu family had recruited him to create the official biography of Yoni Netanyahu. This is a portion from that. At Bibi Netanyahu's dinner table in Jerusalem, I listened with crawling dismay to Bibi talking about the future of his country. In the next war, if we do it right, we'll have a chance to get all the Arabs out, he said. We can clear out the West Bank, sort out Jerusalem. He joked about the Golani Brigade, the Israeli infantry force in which so many men were North African or Yemenite Jews. They're okay as long as they're led by white officers, he grinned. I mean, the guy is, Ilan Pappy made a point that, like, if anybody was to do a biography on Bibi Netanyahu, the page, the inclusion of ideology would be a page long. That he's mostly interested in power, but I do think that, like, you can't dismiss the fact that there's an enormous amount of racism associated with this.
David Remnick said something similar back in the 2000s too. Like, I had meetings with Bibi and Netanyahu in the 80s, and like, I've never heard somebody so racist.
I mean, you can also see it within the Netanyahu's government treatment of Ethiopian Jews. I mean, like, there will be a new word kind of coined for this version of extreme, like, racist supremacy that Israel is engaging in, and that is how you have to view the dehumanization of the Palestinians through that lens.
In a moment, we're going to interview Robert P. Jones, president and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute, author of The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. And I think none of this has to do directly with what's going on right now in Gaza, but the idea of a white supremacy that first sort of finds its roots in the way that it deals with indigenous people, I think will have some resonance for what we've been talking about. First, a couple words from our sponsor. Always awkward to make this transition in times like this. But for some time, as I've mentioned in the past, I have been taking Nutrafol. I was getting a little bit worried. I mean, I wasn't like, I don't know if I'm noticeably thinning for someone my age, but I was aware of it. And I didn't want to take any like drugs because I don't want any side effects.
Yeah.
And if I'm doing something that's like going to be sort of preventative, I don't want to take something that may have adverse effects on my body in any way. And when they come to us to sponsor the show, Emma had a story of a friend of hers who was helped out tremendously by Nutrafol. And the beauty of Nutrafol, I mean, the reason why I love it is that you don't have to choose between your health and better hair growth. Nutrafol provides a whole body health approach for men and for women, frankly, that promote healthier hair. Like I say, no drugs, no compromises, just better hair. It is the #1 dermatologist recommended hair growth supplement, clinically shown to improve your hair growth. It improves thickness and scalp coverage. Their hair growth supplements use physician-formulated, natural, science-backed ingredients. Their drug-free patented technology provides consistent, reliable results without compromising your sexual health or giving you any other types of side effects. Go to Nutrafol.com/men, take their hair health wellness quiz, identify the causes of your thinning hair, and Nutrafol will give you a personalized plan for better hair health through whole body wellness. Nutrafol supports healthy hair growth from within by targeting root causes of thinning hair, such as stress, hormones, environment, nutrition, lifestyle, and metabolism, again, through a whole body health. And it works. Clinical studies show 84% of men showed improvement in their hair after 6 months of taking Nutrafol's men's hair growth supplements. You can find out why over 4,000 healthcare professionals recommended Nutrafol for healthier hair. Nutrafol.com/men, spelled Nutrafol, Nutrafol.com/men, and then enter the promo code TMR. That's Nutrafol.com/men, promo code TMR. We'll put the link in the podcast and YouTube description. We'll be right back with Robert P. Jones, president and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute, author of The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. We'll be right back. Is this his number, 240? We are back. Sam Seder, Emma Vigland on the Majority Report. Want to welcome to the program Robert P. Jones, president and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute, author of The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. Robert, welcome to the program.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
And we should say this is I think your third book, and this is, I don't know if it's actually a trilogy per se, but the issues that you deal with center around this. I found this one really fascinating, not the least of which because we did an interview for, I think, Indigenous Peoples Day with Peter DeErico, who is a professor emeritus from UMass, also an Indian a lawyer who practices Indian law, and that was the first time I had heard about this doctrine of discovery, which is really, I mean, fundamental to your treatise that the start of white supremacy predates slavery in this country, at least chattel slavery and 1619. Tell us about that.
No, that's right. So. Yeah, this word, the doctrine of discovery that you mentioned, I think is a term that many of us don't know. In fact, if you had asked me about this, 5 years ago, I would have stared at you fairly blankly. And I've got a PhD in religion, had all kinds of, American history courses throughout my education, yet it was not something that was taught to me, not something that registered to me. But as you say, it is the thing that really explains the moral compass that Europeans really brought with them when they landed on these shores of not just of the United States, what we now know as the United States, but the Americas, written more broadly. But in brief, essentially what happened was, right, with the quote unquote discovery of these lands that Europeans did not know existed and people that Europeans did not know existed, it created a moral and kind of theological crisis. And the real question was, well, what rights do these people have that Europeans are bound to respect? And so they looked to the closest thing to international law that existed at that time for the answer to that question, and that was the Christian church in Europe. And at that time, it was before the Protestant Catholic split, so it was the Roman Catholic Church and the head of the church in the Vatican, the Pope in Rome, and they began to develop this doctrine called the Doctrine of Discovery. And it essentially, there's a lot of theological apparatus, but it essentially boiled down to this. To answer the question about whether these people had, basic human rights that Europeans were bound to respect, they answered that question with the question. And the question was, well, are they Christian? And of course, they knew the answer to that question. And if the answer was no, they went on to spell out then that Europeans, because of their quote unquote superior not only a kind of ethnic identity, but superior religion, had the right then to occupy those lands, to steal their goods, and the documents actually spell it out in black and white, like, this is a direct quote, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Right? And that is from the head of the church there, and that really is what sets the moral compass for the first European contact with indigenous people that ultimately also carries over into the transatlantic slave trade.
And so we should just be clear. We're talking about, the 1400s, ranging. I think there was a document in 1452, and then one in the early 1490s, and it's Pope Alexander VI who creates this doctrine, and the really shocking thing about this doctrine to me. Because, we had divine rights of kings and of the sort of these type of doctrines that, were created in this era. This one has been incredibly durable to the point where it is embedded in U.S. constitutional law, has been referenced. We're not talking just back in like the 1820s. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, without, I think, saying the words. This is what the amazing thing was is that this doctrine is referenced maybe through its case law, but the original case law referenced the doctrine of discovery, and it is the fundamental principle that we use in Indian law today in this country. Will you walk us through that a little bit? Because I think the idea that you're showing is that this strain of thinking, this dynamic, exists through our country from its pre-founding, and to see it so embedded with even the liberal icon on the Supreme Court, I think really illustrates that point.
No, that's exactly right. So it may sound kind of quaint, right? If you say, okay, well, this was, these were doctrines in the church from 1452 to 1493. That's a long time ago. So how does this really affect us today? And I should say that year 1493 is the one that's really particular to the Americas, because that's when Columbus actually goes back, all right, and says, I really want a specific moral mandate for the whole colonial settler project, and that's when he gets this additional edict from the Pope in 1493, but it does carry through. And so if you think about it, it is the basic claim that Europeans, both in terms of the terms you hear all the time, or in terms of their civilization and their religion, are superior to the indigenous people here. They're superior to Africans. By using that phrase, civilization and Christianity show up over and over again. And as you say, it gets embedded not just in our kind of moral consciousness and in our culture and our churches, but it gets embedded in U.S. law. So, the kind of main document is in the 1820s, Johnson v. McIntosh, where this just gets spelled out, and it uses that language. In the case law, it says, the superior genius of Europe and justified the taking of these lands, and in exchange, they were given, the indigenous people were given civilization and Christianity. That was the bargain, and that was seen to be a just bargain. And that's the thing that really sets U.S. case law. And you're right, in the early 2000s, Ruth Bader Ginsburg cites footnote number 1 back to this case law that goes all the way back to this idea.
And we should say, I mean, that case was Sherrill, the city of Sherrill versus the Oneida Nation of New York. Folks can go back and listen to the D'Errico interview to sort of like hear this, how this doctrine travels, to our present day regarding Indian law. In fact, there was a case, I think, a year ago that supposedly was received well by advocates of indigenous people, but again, maintained this doctrine in a way that just the outcome worked out. But let's turn to your book, because with that understanding that this is the dynamic, that there is this sort of like doctrine of white Christian supremacy that fundamentally established the fundamental dynamic. You trace this, the way that it moves through our relations with indigenous people as a country to into chattel slavery. Walk us through that. I mean, you chose 3 separate, counties or to look at. The first is Tallahatchie County in Mississippi. And why there?
Yeah. Well, I think it's what I'm trying to do. I think is to just have a step back and to kind of widen the aperture for how we think about American history, both as in the nation and even at the local level. So, I think it's so important what the work that the 1619 Project did, right? Sort of backing us up, because in many ways this is about our origin stories. Who are we? How did we get here? These big questions about American identity that are roiling, the country. And the 1619 Project was so important because it pulled us away from this very narrow view of 1776, right? And these, one image, that kind of famous painting that gets on a postage stamp of these white dudes in Philadelphia with their quill pens and their colonial finery, like that's the beginning of America, right? And so 1619 Project backs it up. But I think even there, the European interactions with Native Americans are more than a century old by the time 1619 holds around. So I think kind of pulling it back, and then I tried to make this concrete by going to local levels, right? So I'm from Mississippi, so one of the places that I picked was to kind of illustrate how this goes all the way down the ground was Tallahatchie County, Mississippi. This is a county up in the Mississippi Delta. It is the county where Emmett Till was killed and where his trial was in 1955, and where his killers were acquitted after just over an hour of the jury deliberating, and then later confessed, of course, to the murder, and no justice was ever done there. If we think about that, I'm trying to kind of hold these two histories together that we usually keep separate. So African American history on the one hand, Native American history on the other. And I have a sentence in the book I think gives you the spirit of it, where I said, Emmett Till was born in 1941, but his story actually begins 500 years earlier, in 1451, when Hernando de Soto actually shows up and quote unquote, claims Spain, discovers the Mississippi River and claims it for Spain. And that trajectory, to understand the full sweep of how we got to where we are, and really to fully understand how do we get to a society where the killing and torture and killing of a 14-year-old boy for allegedly whistling at a woman at a corner store results, in his death, and that the killers go free. Like, how do we get to a society where that's okay, and that this kind of injustice can be done? And to really answer that question, I'm saying we have to really go all the way back, and not only include that, but what happened before slavery, and that is the forced removal of Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Creek indigenous people from those lands that later became the lands we think about, the kind of antebellum lands where enslavement of other peoples was so rampant.
How applicable is this to understanding also manifest destiny, as this being kind of the ideological, great grandfather of manifest destiny?
That's a great question, and we talked about the way that this works itself up through, the ligaments of law, but it also kind of has connective tissue in our culture. So that's, I think, one of the best examples. This idea of manifest destiny, right? It has kind of theological roots to it. Well, destiny, right? Providence is very connected to that idea. So that there is this idea that it was just foreordained that this country would spread from ocean to ocean, and that idea that it was inevitable, and even more powerfully that it was providential, that this would go from ocean to ocean. That's directly tied to this idea that these, kind of make it very plain, this idea from the Doctrine of Discovery that these lands were destined by God to be a kind of promised land for European Americans, and that's what they're for. And so that's fueled even things like a city set on a hill, manifest destiny, all of these ideas kind of pick up their real strength and their moral claims from the Doctrine of Discovery.
Do you have a sense of how because so much of the American project, right, was at least presumably the next step in the democratization of the way that governments exist. So you're no longer a king sitting. We no longer have a king who is sitting there by divine right, and we, as a society, with all the caveats about the imperfection of our existing democracy and the way it was set up, for an aristocracy at that time, et cetera, it did become untethered from the religious, God essentially saying, this is the ruler. And that's where my power comes from. It's God. How did this, can you talk about how that dynamic, how this white supremacy dynamic exists, sort of shed from the religious connotations? Because I think it explains so much of our politics, broadly speaking, both the white supremacy elements, but the patriarchy, all of these things seem to have been founded in a Christian thought, and religious thought more broadly, perhaps. But now sort of get laundered into our society without that element.
No, I love this question. The way that I think about it is, you're right. There was this great achievement of moving away from the divine right of kings, right, to rule by the people, to democracy, trying to bring that into the kind of modern world. And that's so important, right? And something I think as Americans to be proud of. But it didn't come that way cleanly. And in many ways, what happened was we kind of just displaced a divine right of kings to a divine right of European rule, right? So even though it was ruled by, because if you remember, right, the Constitution, it's not for everybody, right? It's for men who are of European descent who own property, right? That's who that's who it transferred from a divine right of kings to the divine right of this elite aristocracy, really. And that's been broadened over our history. I think that's really important as well. But I think it's worth remembering the contradictions that we brought with it, even as we were broadening, moving away from divine right of kings, trying to broaden it. But, and again, it's in the, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, among the complaints, right, that the white male colonists are making back to the King of England, they mention, they call Native Americans merciless savages in the Declaration of Independence. And they're complaining that the king is supporting slave rebellions among them, right? So this white supremacy, white Christian supremacy is still built even into the complaints they're leveling against the King of England in the Declaration of Independence. And of course, even in the Constitution, again, it's women aren't included in those rights. It explicitly excludes Indians. And that's the word, excluding Indians is actually in the Constitution. Only counted people of African descent, right, as 3/5 of a person, and then only to accrue to the power of white men, not to themselves. So I think the power of telling the story and kind of backing up and seeing this connective tissue and seeing the story this way is to see that, yes, like these are great achievements, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, democracy, but they came with them, built into them, contradictions, right, that we're still kind of weeding out.
Well, I don't want to belabor this too much, but it feels like on some level the God juice, right, that gave you the sort of the power to be king was sort of transferred when we got to this country to money, or really more specifically property. Because when we talk about all of this, the notion of property rights and the accumulation of property and the accumulation of wealth are built into all of this, right? It's like a chattel slavery. It is, we're taking these lands ultimately to produce more wealth. Women can't own their own property. They are in fact property of their husband. It all like sort of centers around this sort of like a property juice, if you will. And the system is set up so that only one particular type of person has access to this property. But because they have, and we still see that today, it seems to me on the right, property values sort of exist like God exists. At one point we decide it's there, and then that's property rights are inalienable.
Yeah, the one thing I'd say back to that is I think, what I'm interested in is how do you make such an audacious claim, right? That here we are, we're coming over from Europe, we're going to land on these shores, and then all of this land now belongs to us, right? How do we make that? And that we can harness enslaved people's labor and accrue all that wealth to us. I mean, these are wild, right, audacious claims to be making. And so the way you make those and the way you justify them is that you attach them to a religious claim, right? And ultimately what you claim is this is the way that God has designed the world. That is the ultimate, right, and kind of moral justification. If you can assert that, look, we didn't make the rules, God made the rules, and God set up these hierarchies this way, and we just happen to be at the top of the pyramid. But it's not us; it's God. If you want to take it up, and in fact, that's the way that anti-abolitionist arguments went in the U.S. Made exactly those kinds of claims, and it's exactly what the documents do that displace Native Americans and make claims to those lands.
Talk a little bit about, you also look at Duluth, Minnesota, and you start with this sort of juxtaposition of escaped slaves, I guess, and Native Americans who were being dispossessed. Tell us about that and what that tells us, why that story sort of like illustrates this point more too.
Yeah, well, I opened the whole book, as you know, with that story from Minnesota, and I should say, I didn't want to write. So I've got 3 states, Mississippi and Oklahoma and Minnesota, that I use as case studies for the book, and I didn't want to just pick on states that were in the Deep South or very conservative states politically today, like Oklahoma. But I wanted to kind of make the point, this was really an American story. I could have written 50 chapters, or one for each state, easily, and told stories like this of indigenous removal, genocide, and enslavement, then kind of settler colonialism. But in Minnesota, I began this story because these worlds actually collide, and you can see this history intertwined in one story. And just briefly, there is an enslaved man named Robert Hickman, who is literate. He's actually a preacher, and he gets word of the Emancipation Proclamation, and he's in Missouri, so it doesn't apply to him in Missouri because it's not a state in rebellion, which is what the Emancipation only restricted itself to. But nonetheless, he takes the opportunity to set out and to free his family and neighbors, and they push out on a raft, hoping to get picked up by a Union steamer, which they do. They tow them up to Fort Snelling outside of the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, and they disembark there. And what's remarkable is that as they're disembarking, right, kind of reaching their freedom from enslavement, they encounter this group of hundreds and hundreds of Dakota people who've been rounded up the previous year, and are in fact on their way to be exiled, shipped out of Minnesota in the wake of clashes between the Dakota people and the federal government over treaty obligations that the federal government was guilty of not honoring. But sent in, the cavalry, defeated people, and then rounded them up, kept them in a miserable encampment all winter, and then were waiting for the spring thaw to ship them and exile them from the state. And so you have this kind of very poignant example of, on the one hand, formerly enslaved people finding their freedom, and the last vestiges of sovereignty of the Dakota people in Minnesota all at the same time. And I think what's behind that, too, is that just previously there had been in that area the largest mass execution that the federal government has ever presided over. It was 38 Dakota men who were hung on the same day for their part in the uprising there. And also, I think the thing that kind of holds these, this complex history of ours together is that these 2 documents, the Emancipation Proclamation and the documents that were going to sign the fate of these 38 Dakota men, were on the desk of Abraham Lincoln at the same time, and he signed off on both.
It's fascinating history, and then you also get into I think folks on this program are familiar with the Oklahoma race massacres and the Tulsa, and frankly many of them that were happening at this time, but the idea that the Trail of Tears and the Indian Removal Act was largely a function of plantation owners in Georgia wanting more fertile land, and Georgia and Alabama, and then basically sending these people ultimately, to the extent that they lived, to Oklahoma. Is it just the sort of the coincidence of those 2 things happening, around Oklahoma, or is there a direct or indirect lineage there?
Well, what's remarkable, I didn't really kind of pull all this together until I was deep in the research for the book. But these 2 things are happening exactly the same time. I was just actually in Tulsa last week, and I intentionally waited to see the movie Killers of the Flower Moon until I was in Tulsa. And I watched it at an old theater that was built in the 1920s in Tulsa while all this was happening. And I think to make the connections, like we learned about the Tulsa Race Massacre, but it didn't get connected for the most part in the public conversations to what was known as the Reign of Terror among the Osage. And that was happening just 60 miles away, just up the road from Tulsa at the same time, right? And so these were absolutely connected events. On the one hand, you've got, and you can see the connective tissue, right? It's about power. It's about seeing wealth by anyone non-white as illegitimate, property ownership as illegitimate. So, at the same time, the Osage, just briefly, were being, who ended up got pushed around several times, ended up on land that white people thought were worthless until it turned out there was oil under that land, and became fabulously wealthy because of that. And then white people turned out to, start this campaign to poison people, to marry into families, to inherit the head rights. It was a really ugly history, but that's happening right down the road from the Tulsa Race Massacre, where, white roving bands of white people kind of over a period of a couple of days, murdered over 300 African Americans and burned down the entire section of Greenwood. But it's all, I think, motivated by this, again, this idea of like, who are the legitimate inheritors of the land, right? As white European people. And just put one little kind of period on this. I actually dug up sermons that were preached in Tulsa the Sunday after the Tulsa Race Massacre. And you could see the Doctrine of Discovery just rearing its head there, where they essentially pretty uniformly blamed the African American people for the violence, and just denied any culpability among white people there in Tulsa.
I want to get to sort of the your, I guess, prescription to the extent that there is one. But before we do, and this may be, somewhat outside of your portfolio, but I'm curious because, one of the things that, and obviously, there's a lot going on right now in Gaza, and that is, sort of the many of today's sort of like events are, sort of, at least in the context of my mind, filtering through that. And I think back to the Balfour Declaration and the idea that, Balfour certainly was looking for a way to get the Jews out of, at least of England, and thought, okay, this might be a good location. That's back in 1917. Obviously, the Israel is not founded until 40 some odd years later. But I'm curious about the sort of ability for white supremacy to be sort of like bequeathed. Because the dynamic of, even in the Balfour Declaration, it said you need to respect the rights of the people living there. And certainly at that time, Jews were a significant minority, 1800s through the 1900s, really, until the last decade. I mean, they were still a minority in the last decade before the founding of Israel, but like a significant, like single digits minority. But this idea of like, we don't like you, but you're close enough to us that we're going to give you the sort of the magic ticket, which allows you to dispossess the people who are even lot less like us.
Yeah, it's not my field, so I'm going to be very kind of narrow in my response here. The one thing I would point to, that there is a direct connection, actually, to Jewish people in this kind of doctrine of discovery conversation we've been talking about. It's a little different than what you're talking about. The one thing I would point to is that the other thing that's happening in 1493 and in those areas around there, as these papal edicts are coming about, is that locally in Europe, so we've been talking about how they're getting used across the Atlantic and the Americas, but locally in Europe, these same edicts, right, the term that got used for basically, again, that kind of qualifying question, are they Christian? And if the answer was no, the term that got used was they are to be considered enemies of Christ, like that kind of very bellicose term. And that term got applied to Muslims, to Jews, to not just to sort of indigenous people or African peoples, but to Muslims and Jews as well, that justified, like, the expulsion of Jews from the Iberian Peninsula in the 15th century as well. So like this is kind of goes all the way back, and it's a lot more complicated in the 20th century. I think with the kind of this idea of Judeo-Christian kind of amalgamation that we get in the 20th century, but I think even when you hear that term, it's not always as solidarity laden as one might think when you hear that term.
Well, we've seen in this country the sort of like growing, who gets to be white has evolved over the course of, particularly in the 20th century. And that dynamic as it suits, various people. You got to deal with the Ottoman Empire. I got a twofer here. I can get the Jews out, but also still have a connection that will help us, deal with sort of like our rivals that are growing in the region. But let's talk about, to the extent that there is a path out of this dynamic. Talk about what your ideas are in that respect.
Yeah. Well, and all of your listeners should be relieved to know that there is no 12-step plan at the end of the book. Everyone should be suspicious if there was one. This is a multi-century problem that we've been dealing with, and these contradictions are. But I still think that we see it. We're going to see it over and over again in our politics over the next 12 months. We saw it I think this rearing its head in the election of Mike Johnson last week, right? As Speaker of the House. I mean, he is the embodiment. I wrote a piece last week called him the embodiment of Christian nationalism in a tailored suit. That's I think in many ways what he represents. But this deep, whenever we hear our politics dividing along these lines, and that is like, are we, a pluralistic democracy where everyone stands on equal footing before the Constitution and the law, or are we this other vision? Are we a divinely ordained promised land for European Christians? Is that really who America is? Is that the claim that we're hearing being made? And we hear that claim, I think, from Mike Johnson and others in today, right? This is not a 500-year-old problem. It's still with us today. But I think on the hopeful side, I mean, the second part of the title is "And the Path to a Shared American Future." When I find some hope, I think is on the ground. And the other thing I did is in each of these communities we've been talking about, Texas, Oklahoma, Minnesota, I kind of hung out with folks on the ground that have been doing the hard work of reckoning with this history, telling the truth, and doing it in a way that is laying a foundation for a better and different future across lines of race and religion, and laying the groundwork for a pluralistic democracy. Just one quick example from Mississippi. It's a very rural county. It's a very poor county, not a lot of resources there. And yet a dozen or so folks got together a few decades ago and said, you know what, we need to tell the truth about what happened here in Tallahatchie County. And we need to issue an apology to the Till family, which had never been done. There were no historical markers in the county that it happened, even though Till's story was known all over the world. On the ground there in Tallahatchie County, there was virtually nothing. And they began to do that work and issued this apology to the Till family and then kept working. There's now markers all over telling this story. And I think this is not in the book because it just happened this summer. It resulted in a new national monument that President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris just announced, the creation of the Emmett Till and Mamie Till Mobley National Monument that'll be jointly held in Tallahatchie County, Mississippi, and Chicago. That'll be administered by the National Park Service, right? So I think this story now from this group of intrepid group of black and white descendants of enslavers and descendants of the enslaved came together to tell the story and to try to make some healing, build some healing in their local community that's had national consequences. So I think if I find some hope, that's where I'm finding it, seeing this work on the ground.
Well, it's a fascinating look into these, obviously to the I guess the fundamental sort of like building blocks of white supremacy, or at least how it's rationalized. Robert P. Jones, president, founder, Public Religion Research Institute. The book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. We'll put a link to that at majority.fm and in the podcast and YouTube description. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Great conversation.
Thank you.
All right, folks. We will take a quick break in a moment when we say goodbye to, there we go. Head into the fun half. Just a reminder, it's your support that makes this show possible. You can become a member at jointhemajorityreport.com. When you do, you not only get the free show free of commercials, you should know that we put all the links in the podcast and YouTube description, so you get a discount if you want these products. And again, all of these products, almost all of them I use. I feel like there was one or two that was not for a guy.
Yeah.
For me, anyways. But for the most part, we use all these products. And so check them out. They're approved by me. So I guess I don't know what the value of that
Your
is.
stamp of approval.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I found them, they work. And you get a discount. So check that out on occasion. But as a member, you won't hear it. You get the podcast delivered to your box without that, or to your player without those ads. Also, you can IM the show at and pick up the app at majorityapp.com. The app is free, but once you become a member, you can IM the show during the show live. Also, don't forget Just Coffee, fair trade coffee. The Majority Report blend, featuring the Majority Report blend, among others. Great coffee, great co-op, movement partners. Been the oldest sponsor we've had on the program. JustCoffee.coop. Emma, ESVN. You guys talking about the Celtics game that Saul and I went to on Saturday night.
Absolutely. The whole show centered around it. Just kidding. CJ Stroud is the man.
Bring Saul in to talk about it.
Oh, we should bring Saul in. I mean, I got to say, though, this is going to be maybe an insufferable episode because I keep taking victory laps about CJ Stroud, but he's amazing. We'll talk about the stacked AFC North. The Pats are terrible.
Oh, my God.
So
I know.
are the Giants.
I'm going to the game. Well, that's the beauty. Saul and I are going to go to the game of the...
God, when is that game?
The 26th.
So the Pats are going to win that game because the Giants both have their two top quarterbacks are going to be out. One is out for a year. The other's out for 4 games.
Love it.
So congratulations to you.
Want to take him to a game that he's going to watch the Patriots win, even though they are garbage.
It'll be great to watch them win 7-3. So we'll be speaking about that at youtube.com/ESPN show at 4 p.m. Also, Harbaugh versus the NCAA, the sign stealing scandal. Very interesting stuff there. Harbaugh's an asshole, and that's obvious.
Matt.
Yeah, Left Reckoning. We did a clip show, patreon.com/Left Reckoning, and we'll be talking about masculinity and loneliness, as well as some Spanish politicians with PRRI more tomorrow evenings. Patreon.com/Left Reckoning to support the show.
All right, 646-257-3920. We'll turn on the phones soon. See you in the fun half. Left is best. Jamie and I may have a disagreement.
Yeah, you can't just say whatever you want about people just because you're rich.
I have an absolute right to mock them on YouTube.
He's up there buggy whipping like he's the boss.
I am not your employer.
You know, I'm tired of the negativity.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset you. You're nervous. You're a little bit upset. You're riled up.
Yeah, maybe you should rethink your defense of that, you fucking idiots.
We're just going to get rid of you.
All right.
But dude. You want to smoke this joint?
Yes.
Do you feel like you are a dinosaur?
Some good shit.
Exactly. I'm happy now.
It's a win-win.
It's a win-win-win.
Oh, hell yeah.
Now listen to me. 2, 3, 4, 5 times. 847-906-501-457. 2, 38, 56, 27. One half, 5/8, 3.9 billion.
Wow.
He's the ultimate math nerd.
Don't you see?
Why don't you get a real job instead of spewing vitriol and hatred, you left-wing Limbaugh?
Everybody's taking their dumb juice today.
Come on, Sammy.
Dance, dance, dance.
Rand Paul.
I had my first post-coital scene with a woman. I'm hoping to add more moves to my repertoire. All I have is the dip and the swirl.
Fine, we can double dip.
Yes, this is a perfect moment.
No.
Wait, what?
You make under $1 million a year. You're scum. You're nothing.
Excuse me? Fuck you, you fucking liberal elite. I think you belong in jail.
Thank you for saying that, Sam. You're a horrible, despicable person.
All right, gonna take a quick break. I want to take a moment to talk to some of the libertarians out there. Take whatever vehicle you want to drive to the library. What you're talking about is jibber jabber.
Classic. I'm feeling more chill already.
Good. Donald Trump can kiss all of our asses.
Hey, Sam. Hey, Andy. You guys ready to do some evil?
Hitler was such an idiot.
That guy might be a Nazi.
Agree.
No.
Death to America.
Do.
Yes.
Wow.
Wow, that's weird. No way! Unbelievable. This guy's got a really good hook. Throw our hands up.
Ooh.
Wow.
But Sam, I gotta get off.
No worries. Let's. I want to just flesh this out a little bit. I mean, look, it's a free speech issue. If you don't like me,
Hey, shut up.
Thank you for calling into the Majority Report. Sam will be with you shortly.
we are back. Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland, Majority Report. Sam's bitchin' de brag. De brig? Sam's bitchin' de brig. I don't know what that means. Biden down. Is it? Do you know what that means? Okay. Sam's bitchin' de brig.
Bitch.